Good evening and welcome once again. The world outside can wait. For the next little while, there is only this space and the quiet unfolding of a story. Let go of the need to think, to plan, to remember. Simply be present. Notice the gentle rise and fall of your chest with each breath. Feel the stillness settle into your limbs, a pleasant weight that signals the beginning of rest. The story will be here to accompany you, a soft murmur in the quiet, a path for your thoughts to follow as they drift towards sleep. It is a comfort to know that as you listen, others are listening too, each in their own quiet corner of the world. If it brings you a moment of peace, feel free to share where you are joining us from tonight in the comments. But for now, the story is all that matters. Let it begin. Once upon a time, in a world that moved at the pace of a horse's walk and a ship's slow glide, there lived a very wealthy merchant. His home was a tall, stately house in the heart of a bustling port city, a house whose many windows overlooked the cobblestone streets where the commerce of the world flowed like a river. The air in these streets was thick with the scent of sea salt, foreign spices and damp wool. The sounds were of cartwheels on stone, the calls of vendors and the distant resonant bells of ships arriving in the harbour. The merchant's life was one of comfort and order, his days filled with the quiet rustle of ledgers and the soft clink of coins. He was a good man with a gentle disposition, and he was the father of 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. His sons were capable and were beginning to learn the family trade, but it was his daughters who occupied the center of his world. His 2 eldest daughters were fair of face, but their hearts were filled with vanity and pride. They thrived on the attention their father's wealth brought them. Their days were a succession of fine new gowns, society balls, and endless chatter about which suitor was the most handsome or the most rich. They looked down upon the other merchants' daughters, believing that only a duke or a prince would be a worthy match for them. They spent their hours demanding new jewels, new dresses of satin and lace, and mocking their younger sister, who they found to be hopelessly simple. The youngest daughter was, by the estimation of all who knew her, the most lovely of the 3. As she grew from a pretty child into a stunningly beautiful young woman, she became known to everyone simply as Beauty. This name only increased the jealousy of her sisters, but unlike them, Beauty's character was as lovely as her appearance. She was modest, kind, and possessed a quiet spirit. She found no pleasure in the city's endless parties. Her greatest joy was to read, and she would spend her allowance not on trinkets or ribbons, but on books, losing herself for hours in tales of forgotten lands and quiet heroines. For many years, this life of placid prosperity continued. The merchant provided for his children's every whim, the ships came and went from the harbour, and the rhythm of their lives was unbroken. But fortune is a fickle tide, and one day it turned. The merchant received devastating news. His entire fleet of trading ships, caught in a sudden, violent tempest on the far side of the world, had been lost to the sea. In a single stroke, his immense fortune was gone. The grand house in the city was seized by his creditors, along with the fine furniture, the carriages, and the silks. The family was left with nothing but a small, humble cottage in the countryside, a relic of a less prosperous time in their family's past. The move was a great shock to them all. The cottage was dark and draughty, surrounded by a dense, unyielding forest. Life was no longer a gentle procession of comforts, but a cycle of hard manual labor. The sons took to felling trees and working the small plot of land. The merchant, unaccustomed to such toil, fell into a quiet despair. The 2 eldest daughters complained from morning until night. They did not know how to cook or clean, and they mourned the loss of their fine clothes and the admiration of their social circle. They would spend their days sitting by the meagre fire, lamenting their fate. Only Beauty adapted with a steady and uncomplaining heart. She rose before the sun to clean the cottage, prepare their simple meals, and tend to the small garden. Her work was hard, and her hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and chapped. In the evenings, when the day's labour was done, she would not complain as her sisters did, but would sit near her father, reading to him from one of the few books she had managed to save, her calm voice a small comfort in the draughty house. They lived this way for a year. the seasons turning in the quiet green world outside their door. Then one day, a letter arrived, carried by a weary messenger. It brought news that gave the family a sudden, dazzling glimmer of hope. One of the merchant's ships, thought to have been lost with the others, had miraculously survived the storm and had just arrived in the very same port they had been forced to leave. It was laden with valuable cargo. Immediately, the two eldest sisters were giddy with excitement, certain their days of poverty were over. They crowded around their father, who was preparing for the long journey back to the city to settle his affairs. "Oh, father," cried the eldest, "you must bring me a new gown of the finest crimson velvet with pearl buttons." "And for me," said the second, "you must bring a necklace of brilliant green gems to match my eyes and a dozen new silk ribbons." Their lists went on and on, a cascade of pent-up desire for the luxuries they had lost. When they had finally finished their demands, the merchant turned to his youngest daughter. Beauty had been standing quietly to the side, asking for nothing. "And what of you, Beauty?" he asked, his voice soft. "Is there nothing your heart desires?" Beauty had not believed the cargo would be enough to purchase such lavish gifts, and she did not want to add to her father's burdens. "Since you have asked, dear father," she said gently, "I would ask only that you bring me a single rose, for none grow in this part of the country, and it is my favorite flower." The merchant, touched by her simple and heartfelt request, promised that he would. He set off on his journey, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. But when he reached the port, his hopes were dashed once more. He discovered that after his creditors had taken their share of the cargo, there was nothing left. He was as poor as he had been when he left. Defeated, he began the long, sorrowful journey home, with no gifts for his daughters and no fortune to restore their lives. As he rode through the great forest that bordered his lands, the weather began to turn. The sky grew dark, the wind began to howl through the skeletal branches of the trees, and a thick, heavy snow began to fall, blanketing the path and obscuring all landmarks. He soon became hopelessly lost. The snow fell thicker and faster, and the biting wind chilled him to the bone. His poor horse could barely walk, and the merchant feared they would both perish from the cold and exhaustion. The darkness of night was absolute, and he had given up all hope. It was then, through the thick curtain of falling snow, that he saw it, a single, distant light, glowing with a steady warmth. He urged his horse toward the light, his last bit of strength fueled by this new hope. He soon found that the light was coming from the windows of a magnificent castle, one he had never known existed in the heart of this forest. The castle was vast and imposing, with tall, dark towers that seemed to touch the stormy sky. As he approached, he was surprised to find the great iron-wrought gates were standing slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Seeing no one, he called out, but only the sighing of the wind answered. He led his horse into a courtyard and found a warm, dry stable, also open, with fresh hay and oats waiting in a trough. His horse, weary from the journey, began to eat immediately. The merchant, half frozen and starving, made his way to the castle's main entrance. The heavy oak doors swung open silently before he could even touch them. He stepped inside into a grand hall, illuminated by the light of 100 candles and warmed by a roaring fire in a cavernous fireplace. A long table was set for a single diner, laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, and a carafe of deep red wine. It was a feast fit for a king, yet the castle was utterly, profoundly silent. There were no servants, no guards, no sound of life at all. Though he was unnerved by the strangeness of it all, his hunger and cold were more powerful than his fear. He cautiously sat at the table and ate until he was full, and drank the wine, which warmed him from the inside out. Feeling his strength return, he began to explore the silent, opulent halls. He passed through room after room, each filled with priceless tapestries, velvet curtains, and gilded furniture, yet he saw not a single living soul. He eventually found a bedroom where a fire was also burning, and a bed with fresh, clean linens had been turned down, waiting for him. Exhausted beyond measure, he surrendered to the mystery of the place, lay down upon the bed, and instantly fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. When he awoke the next morning, the sun was streaming through the tall windows. He found a set of fine, new clothes laid out for him, replacing his own travel-worn garments. The strange, silent hospitality continued. A hot breakfast was waiting for him in the great hall. He ate, and as he prepared to leave, he thought to himself that he must thank his unseen, generous host. But the castle remained as silent as a tomb. He went to the stable to retrieve his horse and saw that it was well rested and groomed. As he was leading the horse through the courtyard toward the gate, he passed by the most beautiful garden he had ever seen. Despite the snow covering everything outside the castle walls, this garden was in full, impossible bloom. And there, in the center of a manicured bed, he saw it, a bush of perfect red roses, their petals like velvet, glistening with dew. It was then that he remembered his promise to Beauty. Thinking that his mysterious host would surely not begrudge him a single flower after offering such lavish hospitality, he reached out and plucked the most beautiful rose from its stem. The instant he did so, he heard a terrible, deafening roar. The ground seemed to shake, and from the depths of the garden a horrifying figure emerged. It was a creature of immense size and terrifying appearance, a being that was part man and part beast, with eyes that burned with a furious, intelligent light. "Ungrateful wretch!" The beast's voice boomed, a sound that was a deep, resonant growl. "I save your life, I give you food and shelter, and this is how you repay me? By stealing the one thing I love in this world. You will pay for this with your life." The merchant fell to his knees, trembling with terror. "My lord, forgive me," he stammered. "I did not mean to offend. The rose, it was not for me. It was a gift for my youngest daughter, Beauty. It was the only thing she asked of me." The beast was silent for a long moment, its burning eyes studying the terrified man. Its expression was unreadable. "I will spare your life on one condition," the creature said at last, its voice lowering to a menacing calm. "You must bring me one of your daughters to take your place. She must come here of her own free will to live in this castle. If she agrees, you will be free. If not, you must return in 3 months to receive your punishment. Swear to me you will do this." Desperate to save his own life, the merchant swore the oath. The beast then told him he could leave, but that he should not go empty-handed. It pointed to a large, empty chest in the hall. "Fill this with whatever you desire, and it will be transported to your cottage ahead of you." The merchant, dazed and heartbroken, did as he was told, numbly filling the chest with gold coins and jewels, knowing it would do nothing to heal the sorrow he was about to bring upon his family. He then mounted his horse and fled the enchanted castle, the beautiful, terrible rose still clutched in his hand, a symbol of the dreadful bargain he had made. The sun rose not with a triumphant burst of colour, but with a slow, apologetic seep of grey light that filtered through the tall, arched windows of Beauty's new chamber. It was a light that seemed to have no warmth, merely the function of illuminating the profound silence that had reigned through the long, wakeful night. Beauty had not slept. She had remained seated in a high-backed velvet armchair, its plushness a mockery of comfort to her rigid, tense body. Sleep was a country she could not find the path to, her mind a turbulent sea of grief, fear, and a disorienting sense of unreality. The castle's silence was a physical presence. It was a thick, heavy blanket woven from centuries of solitude. It absorbed sound, deadened thought. In the cottage, silence had been a peaceful thing, punctuated by the gentle hum of the natural world, the chirping of crickets, the distant whisper of wind in the pines, the soft crackle of a log in the hearth. Here, the silence was absolute, sterile, and ancient. It was the sound of a world holding its breath, waiting for a conclusion that never came. As the grey light strengthened, she finally rose, her limbs stiff and protesting. A part of her, a primal, frightened part, expected the door to be locked, to find herself a true prisoner in this opulent cell. But when she placed a trembling hand on the cool brass handle, it turned smoothly. The heavy wooden door swung inward without a sound, revealing the long, silent corridor, its marble floor gleaming faintly in the morning gloom. The castle was not holding her captive with locks and bars. Its chains were made of something far more subtle, isolation and fear. She forced herself to begin a more thorough exploration of her designated apartment. not with any sense of curiosity, but with the numb detachment of a condemned soul cataloguing the details of her own prison. The bedroom, which she had barely glanced at, was a sea of luxurious textures. The vast canopy bed was draped in silks the colour of clotted cream, and the duvet was so thick and soft it seemed to be made of spun clouds. In the adjoining dressing room, a magnificent wardrobe of dark, polished wood stood agape. She had brought with her a small bundle containing a few simple, homespun dresses, but the wardrobe was already full. It held dozens of gowns, each one a masterpiece of tailoring and artistry. There were velvets in the deep blue of a twilight sky, satins that shimmered like liquid moonlight, and delicate muslins embroidered with intricate patterns of silver thread. Soft leather slippers lined with rabbit fur lay beside elegant shoes with gemstone buckles. It was a trousseau fit for a queen, a silent, baffling offering from her monstrous host. She felt a wave of revulsion. It felt like being offered a beautiful costume for her own execution. She passed from there into the bathing chamber, a vast room of pale green-veined marble. In its centre, a sunken pool of water steamed gently, its surface strewn with floating rose petals. The air was thick with the warm, humid scent of lavender and chamomile. The impossible luxury of it all, the sheer thought-out decadence, was more unsettling than a bare stone cell would have been. What kind of creature builds such a place of comfort and beauty, only to inhabit it with its own terrifying presence? The contradiction was a knot in her mind she could not begin to unravel. It was the library that finally, mercifully, pierced through the thick fog of her despair. The double doors at the end of her apartment's main hall were taller than any she had ever seen. When she pushed them open, a gasp escaped her lips, a small, sharp sound that was immediately swallowed by the immensity of the room. It was not a room, it was a sanctuary. It was circular, soaring 2 stories high to a domed ceiling painted with a map of the night sky, its constellations picked out in what looked like real silver dust. A delicate, spiraling iron staircase, its banister shaped like interwoven vines, led to a railed balcony that encircled the entire upper level. Every inch of the curved walls, from the polished floor to the distant ceiling, was lined with books. Thousands upon thousands of them. They were bound in leathers of every shade, the deep, mossy green of the forest, the rich burgundy of old wine, the soft, warm brown of autumn leaves. Their spines glinted with titles embossed in elegant gold-leaf script. The air here was different. It carried the scent of old paper, of leather, of beeswax polish, and of time itself. It was the most comforting, most beautiful scent she had ever known. For the first time since her father had ridden away, a flicker of genuine emotion, something other than fear or sorrow, stirred within her. She stepped forward, her soft shoes making no sound on the thick, intricate Persian rug that covered the floor. She walked to the nearest shelf and ran a trembling, reverent hand along a row of leather spines, feeling the smooth, cool surfaces beneath her fingertips. Here were the complete works of playwrights she had only read excerpts of. Massive, illustrated histories of forgotten empires, detailed botanical treatises with hand-painted plates of impossible flowers, and shelf after shelf of novels, tales of adventure and love and mystery waiting to be discovered. It was a universe of thought, a boundless ocean of knowledge and story, and it was all here in this silent, enchanted place. She realized with a pang of bitter, aching irony that the beast had unwittingly given her the one thing, aside from her family, that she had always craved above all else. This discovery did not bring her joy, not yet. But it provided an anchor. It was a task, a purpose. To read, to learn, to lose herself in other worlds so that she might, for a few hours at a time, forget the crushing reality of her own. Her first days settled into a strange and lonely rhythm. She would rise, ignore the new gown laid out for her, and dress in one of her own simple frocks, a small act of defiance. She would make her way to the great hall, where a solitary breakfast would appear on a golden plate as if from nowhere. Hot bread, fresh fruit, a pitcher of milk. The food was always exquisite, but it was tasteless to her, each bite a reminder of her solitude. After her meal, the library became her refuge. She would choose a volume at random and settle into one of the deep, comfortable reading chairs by the tall windows. The silent words on the page became her only companions. She read of starfarers and ancient queens, of the philosophies of forgotten sages, and the quiet lives of country doctors. For hours at a time, the story on the page would become more real than the silent castle around her, the characters' voices louder in her mind than the oppressive quiet. In the afternoons, she would force herself to walk, to explore the endless, echoing corridors of her prison. She found a grand ballroom, its chandeliers shrouded in white cloth like sleeping giants, its polished floor reflecting the dusty light from the windows like a frozen lake. She found an observatory at the top of the highest tower, with a huge brass telescope aimed at a sky that was always mysteriously covered in a thin veil of cloud. She walked through long galleries hung with portraits of handsome men and beautiful women in the attire of a bygone age. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her with a shared, mournful pity, as if they too were prisoners of this place. The entire castle felt like a mausoleum, a magnificent tomb built to house a single, profound sorrow. But as dusk began to bleed into the sky each day, her fragile peace would evaporate, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. At precisely 9 o'clock, as the last of the light faded, she would hear it. The sound would begin as a distant, rhythmic thud, a vibration she felt in the floorboards before she heard it with her ears. It was a heavy, ponderous tread, the sound of immense weight moving with deliberate slowness. It would grow louder, nearer, echoing through the empty halls, a terrifying announcement of her jailer's approach. For the first week, she would flee at this sound, retreating to the sanctuary of her rooms, bolting the door she knew would not hold him, and waiting with a pounding heart until the footsteps faded away again into the castle's deep silence. She never saw him, but his nightly patrol was a constant, terrifying reminder of who was master of this enchanted domain. After many days of this solitary, haunted existence, a new feeling began to war with her fear, a profound and aching loneliness. The silence was no longer just oppressive, it was corrosive. She longed to hear another voice, even a monstrous one. She knew she could not spend the rest of her life, however long or short that might be, hiding in her rooms like a frightened mouse. That evening, as the clock in the great hall prepared to strike 9, she made a decision. She did not retreat. She forced herself to remain seated at the long, polished table, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. The air grew cold. The familiar, heavy footsteps began their approach. The sound was more terrifying now that she was not running from it. It was the sound of fate marching toward her. The great double doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and the beast entered. He was a hulking silhouette against the candlelight from the corridor behind him, his form even more massive and intimidating than she remembered. He stopped short when he saw her sitting there. A low sound, a strange mixture of a guttural growl and a pained sigh, rumbled deep in his chest. For a long moment he simply stood there as if he too were surprised by this change in their routine. Slowly he moved to the opposite end of the vast table, putting the entire length of polished wood between them. He sat, his great weight causing the ornate chair to groan in protest. The chasm of silence that stretched between them was fraught with tension. Beauty kept her eyes fixed on the unused golden plate before her, unable to look at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice, when it came, was a deep, gravelly rumble, yet it held no menace. It was surprisingly soft, almost hesitant. "Am I very ugly?" he asked. The question was so simple, so painfully direct, that it disarmed her. She had expected a roar, a threat, a command. Not this, not a question that sounded like a child's plea for reassurance. She did not know how to answer. A lie would be a pointless cruelty, an insult to the intelligence that was clearly behind those monstrous features. Yet the truth felt like twisting a knife. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice so small it was barely a sound. She could not bring herself to meet his gaze. "You are." "I know I am," he rumbled, and there was a note of weary resignation in his voice. "But I am not a fool. Do you find me witless as well as monstrous?" This time, her answer came more readily. The question itself was proof of its own falsehood. "No," she said, her voice a little stronger. "A witless creature could not be so self-aware. Another long, heavy silence descended, but it felt different now. The tension had lessened, replaced by a shared, awkward melancholy. When the spectral meal was over, he rose from his chair. Beauty tensed, expecting him to depart, but he did not. He took a few slow, heavy steps along the side of the table, closing some of the vast distance between them. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, every muscle in her body screaming at her to flee. He stopped a respectful distance away, his great shadowed form looming over her, but he made no move to come closer. "Beauty," he said, and the sound of her own name in his deep, monstrous voice sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "Will you marry me?" The question was so utterly, breathtakingly absurd that she was struck dumb. All her fear, all her sorrow, all her loneliness coalesced into a single moment of dizzying disbelief. She felt a hysterical urge to laugh, but it died in her throat, choked by terror. "No, my lord beast," she managed to stammer, the words tumbling out before she could think. He did not roar, he did not growl in anger or frustration. The sound he made was far worse. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of such profound, hopeless and soul-crushing sorrow that it pierced Beauty's heart more sharply than any threat could have. It was the sound of a wound being reopened, of a hope being extinguished. Without another word, he turned and walked from the hall, his heavy footsteps the sound of pure defeat, echoing away into the waiting silence. Beauty was left alone at the long table, trembling from head to foot, her mind reeling. This bizarre, painful encounter became their nightly ritual. Every evening at 9, she would force herself to dine with the beast. Her terror of him began to slowly, almost imperceptibly erode, like a stone worn smooth by a constant, gentle current. He was always quiet, always respectful. He never raised his voice. He never encroached on her space. He would ask her about her day, and she found herself answering. He would ask what book she was reading, and she would tell him the plot. He asked her what she thought of the castle's gardens, an impossible, sprawling expanse behind the castle where flowers of every season bloomed together in a riot of colour, defying all laws of nature. She found that she could speak to him of ideas, of the philosophies in the books she read, of the constellations she could not see through the cloudy sky. He would listen with an unnerving, intelligent stillness, his sad eyes fixed on her. He was a surprisingly thoughtful conversationalist, his questions insightful, his own observations tinged with a deep, pervasive melancholy. She grew accustomed to his form. Her eyes learned to look past the frightening tusks and the coarse, dark fur to see the profound loneliness that radiated from him like a cold aura. She began to pity him, to see that he was as much a prisoner of this beautiful, empty place as she was. This growing comfort made the end of each evening an exercise in quiet agony. For without fail, as he rose to leave, he would turn his sorrowful eyes to her, his deep voice filled with a desperate, pleading hope that she knew she was about to crush. "Beauty, will you marry me?" And every single night, her own heart heavy with a pity that was beginning to feel like a terrible, wearying guilt, she would have to give the same gentle but firm reply. "No, my lord beast." And every night he would let out that same heartbreaking sigh of despair before turning and departing, leaving her alone once more with her books, her music, and her growing, profound melancholy. The weeks bled into months. The world outside the castle's enchanted domain surely passed through autumn and into winter, but within its walls it was always a gentle, unchanging spring. Beauty's life was one of unimaginable luxury and profound emptiness. The beast was her only companion, and though she no longer feared him and even found a strange, sad comfort in their nightly conversations, their shared loneliness could not fill the aching void in her heart. The longing for her family, particularly her father, grew from a dull ache into a constant, sharp pain. She worried about him incessantly, picturing him wasting away in their draughty cottage, consumed by grief. One evening, after the beast had left her with his usual sigh of defeat, she could bear the not knowing no longer. With a sense of grim purpose, she walked to her sitting room and pulled the velvet cloth from the surface of the magic mirror. Taking a deep, trembling breath, she leaned close to the flawless glass. "I wish to see my father," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silent room. The dark, reflective surface of the mirror did not remain still. It began to swirl, as if a drop of ink had fallen into a pool of still water. The darkness coalesced, the smoky patterns shifting and resolving into a clear, moving image. She gasped and pressed a hand to her mouth. She was looking directly into the main room of their little country cottage. Her father was there, just as she had pictured him, sitting in his customary chair by the fire. But he was so much worse than she had imagined. He was gaunt, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and etched with lines of a deep and abiding grief. He was not reading, not mending a tool, not doing anything at all. He was simply staring, his eyes fixed on the flames with a vacant, empty expression. He was a man hollowed out by sorrow. The sight was a physical blow, a dagger to her heart. She saw now that her sacrifice while saving his life had not brought him peace. It had only condemned him to a slower, more painful end. With tears streaming down her face, she whispered a new request. "Show me my sisters." The image shifted. The humble cottage dissolved, replaced by a lavishly decorated room in a fine city townhouse. Her two eldest sisters were there, preening and posturing in front of a tall mirror. They were adorned in the very jewels the beast's gold had bought them, their hair elaborately styled, their faces painted with cosmetics. They were laughing, surrounded by a crowd of fawning, well-dressed suitors, their lives full of the shallow, noisy gaiety they had always craved. There was no sign in their expressions that they ever gave a single thought to their lost sister or their grieving, wasting father. The sight filled her not with anger, but with a cold, profound disappointment. They were as lost as she was, in a prison of their own making. A new and powerful resolve washed over her, clearing the fog of her sorrow. She was living in a gilded cage, yes, but her father was dying in a cage of grief. She could not allow that. She had to go home. She had to see him, to let him know with her own voice that she was safe and well, to break the spell of sorrow that was killing him. To do that, she would have to ask for her freedom. She would have to ask her lonely, heartbroken jailer to let go of his only companion. She feared with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was the one request the beast would never, ever grant. That night, as she prepared for dinner, she did so with a new and desperate purpose burning in her heart. She would sit through their meal. She would engage in their sad, gentle conversation. She would listen to his philosophies. But when he asked his inevitable nightly question, she would not simply refuse. She would have a bargain of her own to propose. The decision, once it had finally crystallized in the crucible of her grief and guilt, did not bring the relief of a clear path forward. Instead, it settled in Beauty's heart with the cold, unyielding weight of a monolith. The rest of that long, silent day was spent in a state of suspended animation, a waking dream dominated by a single, terrifying purpose. She went to the library, her accustomed sanctuary, but its profound peace was lost to her. The familiar, comforting scent of old paper and leather could not penetrate the thick, insulating fog of her anxiety. The books, her steadfast companions, were now just objects, their covers unopened, their stories locked away. The words on their spines seemed to blur and swim before her eyes, meaningless symbols in a language she no longer understood. She began to pace. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the thick, intricate rugs, but in her mind her footsteps were a frantic, thundering rhythm, a desperate march toward an unknown fate. Back and forth she went, from the tall, arched windows overlooking the perpetually blooming gardens to the spiraling iron staircase at the room's center. She was an actress in a silent play, rehearsing a single, critical scene. She crafted speeches in her mind, intricate arguments woven from logic and reason, only to unravel them moments later, convinced of their futility. She composed pleas steeped in pathos and pity, then discarded them as manipulative and unworthy. How does one reason with a force of nature? How does one appeal to the better angels of a creature who might not possess any? Each imagined scenario ended in disaster. She saw his eyes, those sorrowful, intelligent embers she had grown so accustomed to, narrowing into chips of obsidian, cold and impenetrable. She heard his voice, that low, familiar rumble that had become a strange sort of comfort, erupting into a roar of furious betrayal that would not just echo through the halls, but shake the very stones of the castle, bringing the chandeliers crashing down around her. The fear of that imagined roar was a living entity within her, a cold, coiling serpent in the pit of her stomach. And yet, stronger than the fear, was the image branded onto the inside of her eyelids, the image from the magic mirror. Her father, a wraith in his own home, a man being steadily consumed by his own heart. That image was her courage. That image was her resolve. As the day began its slow, inevitable decline into evening, she returned to her chambers. The act of preparing for their nightly meal, usually a simple routine, became a solemn, meticulous ritual. She went to the great wardrobe, pushing aside the simple homespun frocks she favored, and for the first time, selected one of the gowns the castle had provided. She chose a dress of deep forest green velvet, its fabric heavy and cool to the touch. It was not a choice of vanity. It felt like donning a suit of armor, the rich, dark material a shield for her own fragile, trembling spirit. She brushed her long hair until it shone like a silken mantle over her shoulders, her movements slow, precise, and automatic. She was not preparing for a meal. She was preparing for a trial, a quiet, desperate negotiation for a man's life. When she finally made her way to the Great Hall, the familiar journey felt profoundly different. The long, echoing corridor seemed to stretch on for miles. The hundreds of candles that lined the walls seemed to burn with a hotter, more intense, and distinctly watchful light. Their flames danced and swayed as she passed, as if whispering warnings to one another. The very air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken, looming tension. She was seated at her end of the vast, polished table long before the appointed hour, her hands clenched so tightly in the velvet folds of her dress that her knuckles were bone white. The clock on the mantelpiece, a great, ornate thing of gold and marble, began its slow, chiming journey toward the hour of 9. Each chime was a resonant, doom-laden bell, tolling the seconds away until the confrontation. The final chime faded, leaving a silence that was more absolute than any that had come before. And then it began. That familiar, heavy, ponderous tread. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of her destiny, marching inexorably toward her. The great doors swung open. The beast entered, his massive silhouette, as always, a stark black shape against the candlelight of the corridor beyond. He paused, his head slightly tilted. She knew he had noticed the change in her attire. She felt his gaze on her, heavy and questioning, but she could not bring herself to look up. He moved to his customary seat at the far end of the table, a football field of polished wood and silence stretching between them. The strange, unseen magic of the castle began its work. Hot, fragrant food appeared on their golden plates, delicately roasted fowl, root vegetables glazed with honey, glistening fruits arranged in a perfect pyramid. Tonight, it all looked like wax. Beauty could not imagine swallowing a single bite. Her throat was a tight, narrow knot. The beast, too, was preternaturally still. He sensed the electric tension in the air. The usual melancholy quiet of their meals had been replaced by something sharp and brittle. He did not ask her about the book she was reading, a question he had posed almost every night for months. He did not remark upon the weather in the enchanted gardens. He simply ate, his movements slow, his gaze fixed on his plate, the silence stretched, pulling taut like a bowstring. Beauty felt that if it did not break, she herself would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Finally, when the spectral meal had concluded and the plates had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared, he looked at her across the vast distance. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, tired rumble, devoid of its usual undertones of pleading hope. "You are very quiet tonight, Beauty. Your thoughts are 1,000 miles away." This was it. The door had been opened. Her heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, seemed to stop altogether. Then it started again with a painful, violent lurch. "I have something on my mind, my lord," she said, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized as her own. She took a deliberate, steadying breath, drew on some hidden reserve of courage, and forced herself to lift her chin and meet his gaze. "I have a request, a most serious request, to make of you." He stilled completely, his massive form becoming as motionless as a gargoyle carved from granite. "A request?" he repeated, the two words rumbling with suspicion. Yes, she said, her voice gaining a fractional measure of strength from the sheer, desperate force of her will. She began to speak, and the words she had rehearsed all day came tumbling out, not as a polished speech, but as a raw, heartfelt torrent. She told him of the magic mirror, her voice trembling as she painted a verbal portrait of her father, a man fading like a photograph left too long in the sun. She described his gaunt cheeks, the vacant, hopeless look in his eyes, the way his shoulders, once so strong, were slumped in a posture of utter and permanent defeat. She did not waste breath on her sisters. Their shallow, selfish happiness was a different kind of tragedy, irrelevant to this plea. Her focus was a laser beam on her father, on the suffocating guilt that consumed her, the horrifying realization that her own noble sacrifice had become the instrument of his slow, agonizing demise. He believes me lost to him forever, she explained, and the tears she had been holding back finally broke free, hot and stinging, tracing paths down her cheeks. The sorrow is a sickness, and it is killing him. I cannot bear it. I must go to him. I must stand before him so he can see with his own eyes that I am alive, that I am well. It is the only medicine that will save him. She took a deep, shaky breath, gathering all her remaining strength for the final, critical part of her plea. I beg you, my Lord Beast, she implored, her voice breaking. Let me go home, only for a little while. I give you my most sacred vow. I swear I will return to you. The silence that followed her desperate words was the most profound and terrifying she had ever experienced in the castle. It was not an empty silence. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and warmth from the great hall. It was a silence filled with a colossal, unspoken and monumental anguish. The beast did not move. He did not seem to breathe. He simply stared at her, and in the depths of his sorrowful eyes, she saw a typhoon of emotions. She saw shock give way to a dawning, horrified understanding. She saw betrayal, sharp and stabbing, and beneath it all, she saw a pain so deep, so ancient, it seemed to crack the very air around him. The hundreds of candle flames on the tables and in the sconces all flickered violently at the same instant, dipping and swaying as if stirred by a sudden spectral hurricane. From the deepest foundations of the castle, a low, resonant rumble began, a sound like distant subterranean thunder. When he finally spoke, his voice was utterly transformed. It was no longer the soft, hesitant rumble she knew. It was a guttural, earth-shaking growl, a sound of pure, unrestrained agony that vibrated up through the stone floor and into the soles of her feet. "Leave!" he roared. And the word was not a sound, but a physical force. A shockwave that slammed into her, making her flinch back as if struck. He surged to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the stone floor. His immense form seemed to expand, to blot out the light, to fill the entire hall. "You wish to abandon me?" Beauty shrank in her seat, a cry of pure terror caught in her throat. This was the monster. This was the rage she had so deeply feared waking. "I have given you everything," he bellowed, taking a single, heavy step forward that cracked a flagstone beneath his foot. His clawed hands, which she had only ever seen resting gently on the table, were now clenched into fists the size of cannonballs. "This castle and everything in it, it is yours. The gardens that bloom only for you. The library that holds the knowledge of the world for you. The music that waits only for your touch. Anything you desire, you have but to think of it, and it is yours. I have offered you my meager company. I have offered you my broken conversation. I have laid my very heart at your feet, and your only thought, your only wish, is to abandon me." He took another step, and another, his rage a visible, shimmering aura around him. He was a natural disaster personified. "Do you take me for a fool? Do you think I do not know the ways of the human heart? You will go home. You will return to your family, to your world of sunlight and laughter. You will see their familiar faces. You will hear their beloved voices. You will remember what it is to be among your own kind, and you will never, ever come back. The memory of this place, of me, will become a half-forgotten nightmare. You will leave me to this silence. You will leave me to this solitude, this endless, crushing solitude that you, and only you, have managed to hold at bay." He was halfway down the table now, a terrifying avalanche of fur and fury. Beauty was paralyzed, her mind wiped clean of all thought, her body locked in a state of pure primal fear. She could only stare, her face a mask of terror, her tears falling unheeded as the monster she had foolishly believed she had tamed finally revealed itself in all its terrifying, majestic glory. But then, as he stood looming over her, his shadow swallowing her whole, ready to bring his fist down upon the table and shatter it into 1,000 pieces, a profound change occurred. The raw, violent energy seemed to drain out of him in a sudden, visible rush, as if a plug had been pulled from his very soul. The powerful, tensed shoulders slumped. The burning rage in his eyes cooled, extinguished, replaced by the familiar, soul-deep despair, now magnified 1,000-fold, a black hole of utter hopelessness. He let out a ragged, shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half growl, a sound of complete and utter defeat. "If you leave," he whispered, and his voice, stripped of its rage, was now thin, cracked and fragile. "I will die, Beauty." He looked at her, and his gaze was pleading, desperate. "I do not mean that my heart will be broken with sadness. I have lived with that for a century. I mean that I will cease to be. My life, this castle, all of it. It is tied to you now. Your presence here is the thread that keeps this enchanted world from unraveling into nothingness. If you break that thread, I will die." Beauty stared at him, her terror evaporating, replaced by a wave of overwhelming, crushing pity and a guilt so profound it was physically nauseating. She saw now the terrible, impossible truth of his existence. He was not merely her jailer, she had become his lifeline. She was his unwilling anchor to the world of the living. Her own voice returned to her, though it was little more than a choked, trembling whisper. "I swear to you," she repeated, and the words were no longer part of a plea, but a sacred, binding oath. "I will not abandon you to that fate. My father is dying. Let me go and give him back his life, and I promise you, I will return. I give you my word. It is the only true thing I have to give." He stood over her for a long, agonizing minute, the silence stretching between them once more. She could see the terrible war raging within him, the desperate, primal, selfish need to keep her chained to him forever, clashing with the spark of goodness that recognized the righteousness of her plea. Finally, with a long, slow sigh that seemed to sap the very foundations of his strength, he took a single step back. "1 week," he said, his voice now utterly flat, devoid of all emotion, a voice from the ashes of defeat. "You may go to your father. You have 1 week, 7 days. But if you are not back in this castle by the sunrise of the 8th day, the thread will break. My life will be forfeit." He looked at her one last time, and his eyes were dark, empty pools of utter misery. "And your sacred word will be a lie for all eternity." Relief, so potent it was dizzying, warred with a dread so cold it felt like ice water in her veins. "I will be back," she promised, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Before the sun rises on the 8th day. I swear it." "Go to your room," he said, turning his back on her abruptly, as if he could no longer bear the sight of her face. "In the morning, the means for your journey will be waiting. Do not come to dinner tomorrow evening. I do not wish to see you again until you return." He walked from the room. His tread was different now. It was not the heavy, powerful walk of a monster, nor the ponderous gait she had grown used to. It was the slow, shuffling, unsteady gait of a very old, very broken man, leaving a trail of profound despair in his wake. Beauty fled to her rooms, her heart a wild, chaotic battlefield of warring emotions. She had won. She was going home. But the price of her victory was the utter and complete devastation of the only other soul in this vast, lonely world. She did not sleep that night. But for the first time, it was not fear that kept her awake. It was the crushing, monumental weight of her promise. The next morning, she awoke to find the opulent green velvet gown gone. In its place, laid carefully on a chair, was one of her own simple, homespun dresses, clean and perfectly pressed. It was a quiet, sad acknowledgement of her return to her former life. On the small, polished table beside her bed, where a lavish breakfast usually awaited her, there was only a single, stark object. A simple, unadorned ring of heavy, polished gold. There was no note, no instruction, but she knew, with an instinct born of months spent living within the castle's strange and pervasive magic, what it was for. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling with a mixture of eagerness and trepidation. She packed nothing. She would take no gowns, no jewels, no proof of her time in the enchanted castle. Her only possession from this world would be the beast's ring. She walked through her silent apartment one last time, her gaze lingering on the library, her sanctuary, on the music room, its instruments waiting patiently, on the velvet-draped mirror, her window to a world she had thought lost. It had been her prison, yes, but it had also been her strange and gentle home. She felt a pang of an emotion she could not name, not regret, not precisely, but a deep and abiding sorrow for the lonely, monstrous, and tragic creature she was leaving behind. Standing in the very center of her bedroom, the pale morning light streaming through the window, she slipped the heavy gold ring onto her finger. "I wish to be at my father's house," she whispered into the silent, waiting air. The world did not change. It dissolved. The sensation was not one of movement, but of complete and utter unraveling. The solid marble floor beneath her feet ceased to exist. The familiar walls of her chamber melted away into a vortex of swirling, soundless color and abstract sensation. There was a feeling of being pulled through an impossibly small aperture, a sense of her very essence being unthreaded and rewoven in an instant. It was disorienting, total, and mercifully brief. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. She stood blinking, her senses reeling as they struggled to reassert themselves. The air was the first thing she noticed. It was different. It was cool and damp, and it smelled not of rosewater, old books, and beeswax, but of wood smoke, wet earth, and the humble, familiar scent of boiling vegetable stew. The light was no longer the soft, diffused, magical glow of the castle, but the pale, watery, and slightly grim light of a cloudy morning filtering through a small, grimy window pane. She was standing in the main room of her family's cottage. It was smaller, darker, and infinitely poorer than she remembered. The months spent living in palatial splendor had warped her perspective, but it was undeniably, breathtakingly home. The familiar sight of the rough-hewn wooden table, the mismatched wobbly chairs, the soot-stained stone of the fireplace. It all rushed toward her, filling her with a wave of emotion so powerful, so overwhelming, it made her knees weak. Her father was there. He was sitting at the table, a bowl of thin, greyish broth untouched before him, his gaze distant, unfocused, fixed on a past he could not escape. He had not yet noticed her. Then, the door creaked open and her sisters entered the room, their voices sharp and grating as they began their daily chorus of complaints. "Must we eat this watery slop again? With all that gold father brought back, surely we could afford a proper cook from the village." Their words died in their throats as their eyes fell upon her. They froze mid-complaint, their mouths agape, their eyes wide with utter disbelief. That disbelief was quickly followed by a flicker of something else, a flash of green, ugly envy as they took in her appearance. Her dress was simple, yes, but she radiated a health and vitality that was alien to this place. Her skin was clear, her hair shone, her cheeks held a soft color. She had not been suffering. It was her father who moved first. He looked up from his stupor, his gaze slowly, sluggishly, focusing on her. His eyes, once so dull and lifeless, widened with a dawning, incredulous light. His breath caught in a ragged, painful gasp. "Beauty," he whispered, the name a fragile, impossible question, a ghost on his lips. "Father," she said, and her own voice broke with the weight of that single word. He rose from his chair, stumbling, his hands outstretched as if to ward off a beautiful, beloved apparition. He took one hesitant step, then another. "It cannot be," he murmured, his voice thick with a century of unshed tears. "My old eyes deceive me." She could wait no longer. She ran to him, crossing the small room in 3 quick strides, and threw her arms around his frail frame. He was real. He was dangerously thin, the bones of his shoulders sharp beneath his worn shirt. But he was warm and solid and real. He let out a great, shuddering sob, clutching her to him with a desperate strength she wouldn't have thought he possessed, as if he feared she would dissolve into mist and leave him once more. My child, He wept into her hair, his whole body shaking. "You are alive. You have come back to me." Her brothers, hearing the commotion from the yard, rushed in, their faces flushed from work. They stopped dead in the doorway, their axes held loosely in their hands, their faces a mask of stunned, joyous shock. Then the shock broke, and they swarmed her, hugging her, laughing, their relief boisterous and overwhelming, filling the small cottage with a sound it had not known for a very long time, pure, unadulterated happiness. Amidst the joyful, chaotic reunion, Beauty looked over her weeping father's shoulder at her two sisters. They stood apart, near the doorway, their initial shock having curdled into a mask of forced smiles that did not reach their eyes. Their faces were a battleground of emotions, relief warring with resentment, curiosity with envy. They were not looking at her with the simple love of her father and brothers. They were looking at her with 1,000 grasping, unspoken questions. Where had she really been? What was the castle truly like? And most importantly, what treasures, what riches, what advantages had she brought back with her? The first day of her 7 had only just begun, and already Beauty could feel the simple, honest world of her family's love beginning to clash with the complex, secret, and dangerous world she had left behind. The plain gold ring on her finger, once a symbol of her escape, suddenly felt impossibly, dreadfully heavy. The first hours of Beauty's return were not merely hours, they were a lifetime. They were a dizzying, overwhelming, and profoundly healing deluge of sensation and emotion, a stark, vibrant contrast to the muted, silent elegance of her gilded cage. Her father, once his mind had struggled past the fog of grief to fully accept that she was not a spirit, not a cruel trick of his failing eyes, but solid, breathing flesh, seemed to reverse the course of his own aging. He was a man drinking from a fountain of youth that was his daughter's presence. He could not seem to let her go, his frail, paper-thin fingers clutching hers with a surprising, desperate strength. His eyes, which had been dull, vacant pools of sorrow, were now alight with a miraculous, rekindled fire, and they traced the lines of her face, the curve of her cheek, the shape of her brow, as if he were a blind man given sight, memorizing a world he thought was lost to him forever. He wept and he laughed, often in the same breath, the long-dammed river of his profound grief finally breaking its banks and washing him clean, leaving in its wake not devastation but fertile ground for new happiness. Her brothers, too, were swept up in the raw, unvarnished miracle of it all. They abandoned their axes in the woodpile and their chores in the field, creating a noisy, boisterous and loving circle around her at the rough-hewn table. Their affection was a simple, radiant thing, a powerful, uncomplicated warmth that seeped into Beauty's very bones, thawing the deep, existential chill that had settled there during her last fraught days at the castle. They did not ask of the monster or the magic. Their questions were for her and her alone. Was she well? Was her heart at peace? Was she truly, truly home to stay? For the entirety of that first miraculous day, Beauty allowed herself to be completely and blissfully submerged in this healing tide. She constructed a fortress in the back of her mind, a deep, dark dungeon, and into it she cast the image of the beast's devastated, crumbling face. She walled off the memory of his final broken words, the sound of his shuffling, defeated footsteps echoing away into the profound silence. She existed only in the present, a creature of pure sensation, soaking in the noisy, chaotic, and breathtakingly beautiful reality of her family's devotion. With a heart so full it felt close to bursting, she served her father a bowl of the simple vegetable stew her sisters had scorned and watched as he ate with a genuine, wolfish appetite she had not seen in a year. The sallow, grey pallor of his skin, the colour of old parchment, seemed to recede with every spoonful, replaced by a faint, healthy flush. Her presence was, as she had so desperately prayed, the only medicine his wounded spirit required. Her sisters, however, moved through this vibrant tableau of joyous reunion like wraiths at a feast. After their initial perfunctory displays of high-pitched shrieks and theatrical, tear-filled embraces, their true natures began to bleed through their carefully constructed masks of sisterly love. They orbited the scene, their eyes sharp, analytical, and deeply, nakedly covetous. Their questions were not the open-hearted, guileless inquiries of her brothers, but were carefully crafted, jewel-tipped probes, designed not to welcome her home, but to assess her new status, to take inventory of her experiences. "That is a remarkably humble dress, sister," the eldest remarked, her tone a perfect, poisonous blend of feigned sympathy and critical appraisal. Her eyes did a slow, contemptuous scan of Beauty's practical homespun attire. "Did the master of that dark place not see fit to provide you with finer things? We had imagined you'd return in silks and satins." "And you wear no jewelry," the second chimed in, her own fingers unconsciously fiddling with the gaudy, glittering emerald necklace she wore, a bauble purchased with the beast's own blood money. "Surely a magical castle, however dreadful, would have chests overflowing with gems. Did you think to bring nothing back for the loving family that mourned you so deeply?" Beauty parried their attacks with vague, gentle deflections, her voice soft and even. "The master of the castle was kind in his own fashion, but his world is not one that places value on such things as jewels and finery." It was a lie, of course. A colossal, breathtaking untruth when she thought of the wardrobes overflowing with velvets and brocades, the jewel boxes filled with pearls and diamonds all waiting untouched in her chambers. But it was a necessary lie. To describe the sheer, silent, breathtaking opulence of her captivity would be to pour gasoline on the smouldering embers of their envy, igniting them into a raging, all-consuming inferno that would burn away the fragile peace of this homecoming. She saw in their narrowed, calculating eyes that they did not believe her for a second. They saw the clear, luminous quality of her skin. They saw the newfound confidence in her posture, a quiet grace she had not possessed when she left. They saw the worldly wisdom that now resided in her gaze, and they knew, with an instinct born of their own duplicitous hearts, that she was hiding something significant. And with the avarice that was the very bedrock of their characters, they assumed with absolute certainty that what she was hiding was treasure. The first day passed in a golden, emotional haze. That night, for the first time in what felt like 100 years, Beauty slept in her own small, familiar bed. The mattress was lumpy, stuffed with straw that rustled whenever she turned, and the single blanket she owned was coarse and heavily patched. But it was a bed free from the crushing weight of unspoken sorrow, free from the nightly, dreadful anticipation of a monster's heavy tread. It was a bed in a room that was truly hers, in a house filled with a love that asked for nothing. She fell into a deep, dreamless, and profoundly healing sleep, the sleep of a soldier returned from a long and lonely war. The second day dawned, and the third followed, and with the slow, steady, and deeply comforting passage of time, the initial, ecstatic joy of her return began to mellow. It settled into a comfortable, domestic rhythm that was more precious to her than all the gold in the beast's castle. But as the familiar quiet of country life reasserted itself, two subtle and dangerous undercurrents began to flow, pulling her in opposite directions. First, the memory of the castle, which she had so forcefully and successfully suppressed, began to seep back into the quiet corners of her consciousness like a persistent rising tide. It would happen at the most unexpected moments. While mending a tear in her father's worn shirt, her needle would still, and she would remember the feel of the cool, smooth, buttery leather of a book's binding in the vast, silent library. While kneading dough for their daily bread, the rhythmic, comforting motion would lull her, and she would suddenly see the soaring, book-lined walls, the magnificent domed ceiling with its constellations of silver dust stars. While staring out the small, grimy window at their own meagre garden, with its struggling rows of beans and herbs, she would remember the impossible, breathtaking beauty of the beast's domain, a place where flowers of every season bloomed in a perpetual, defiant and magical spring. And most vividly, most troublingly, most persistently, she would remember him. She would see his eyes, those pools of intelligent, profound and heartbreaking sorrow. She would hear his voice, not the terrifying roar of his final fury, but the soft, gravelly, hesitant rumble of their nightly conversations. She found herself replaying their discussions in her mind as she went about her chores. His insightful questions about the philosophies in the books she read. His sad, poignant musings on the nature of beauty, loneliness, and time. She found herself with a shock that was both bewildering and deeply unsettling, missing him, missing his strange, quiet, and utterly unique company, missing the singular, profound connection they had forged in the heart of that enchanted silence. The second and far more insidious development was the deliberate, calculated, and escalating campaign of her sisters. Their initial, thinly veiled disappointment quickly metastasized into a full-blown, festering, and active resentment. They became spies in their own home, their gazes following her every move with a venomous intensity. They saw the way their father's health and spirits improved with every passing day, how he hung on Beauty's every word, his face shining with a pure, uncomplicated adoration that he had never shown them. They saw the way their boisterous, practical brothers now deferred to her, respecting her quiet wisdom and seeking out her opinions. Beauty, without any effort or intention, had effortlessly reclaimed her place as the gravitational center of the family, a position they had, in their own grasping and selfish ways, attempted to usurp in her absence. Their jealousy, no longer content to merely simmer, began to boil over in acts of subtle, domestic, and psychological cruelty. It was a campaign of 1,000 tiny, poisoned cuts. One afternoon, as Beauty was reading a passage of poetry to her father, whose face was alight with pleasure, her eldest sister tripped, sending a full cup of water cascading over the open book, ruining the fragile pages. Her apologies were a masterpiece of insincere regret. They would make sharp, cutting remarks, designed to be overheard, about her suddenly simple tastes, and her unnatural preference for monstrous company over that of good, handsome men from the village. They whispered to each other in shadowed corners, their voices a sibilant hiss, speculating on the unspeakable horrors and degrading acts she must have endured, painting her as a tragic, pitiful, and slightly tainted figure to any neighbor who would listen, all the while burning with a furious, acidic envy for the secret, privileged life they were convinced she was hiding. Their true goal, however, was far more sinister. They had noticed the heavy, plain gold ring on her finger. Beauty, lost in the joy of her homecoming, had been careless, wearing it constantly. They, with their magpie-like eyes for anything of value, recognized it was no common trinket. They did not understand its function, but they correctly surmised it was magical, the key to her mysterious arrival, and therefore her eventual departure. They did not know the specifics of her promise, the terrible life-or-death deadline she was under. But they knew, with an absolute and terrifying certainty, that she intended to return. And they decided, in the shared, black-hearted council of their souls, that they would do everything in their power to prevent it. Not because they loved her, not because they would miss her, but because they could not bear the thought of her returning to a secret life, a life of power and privilege that excluded them. If they could not have it, then neither could she. On the morning of the 6th day, they began their final, carefully orchestrated assault. They found her in the small vegetable patch behind the cottage, her hands in the cool, damp earth, a place where she felt a fleeting semblance of peace. They approached not with their usual acidic banter, but with their faces arranged in masks of deep, theatrical, and utterly fraudulent sisterly concern. "Dearest Beauty," the eldest began, her voice a silken, saccharine whisper that made the fine hairs on Beauty's arms stand on end. "We have been so desperately, terribly worried about you." "Yes," the other chimed in, her expression a careful, rehearsed study in loving distress. "It simply breaks our hearts to see you so preoccupied, so distant. You seem terribly sad, sister. It is the thought of returning to that dreadful, lonely place, isn't it? To that monster." Beauty was momentarily disarmed by this sudden, unexpected, and masterful performance of sympathy. "I must return," she said, her voice quiet but firm, her gaze steady. "I gave my word." "Oh, your word!" the eldest cried, theatrically dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with the pristine corner of her apron. What is a word given to a monster? A promise extracted under duress. He held you captive. He terrorized our beloved father and threatened his very life. You owe him nothing, Beauty. Nothing. Certainly not your freedom and not your precious life. Stay with us, Beauty, the second sister pleaded, taking Beauty's earth-stained hand in her own. Her skin was soft, pale, and slightly clammy, like that of a toad. Stay here, where you are loved, where you are safe. Think of father. He is only just beginning to truly live again. He sleeps through the night now, without calling your name in his nightmares. If you leave now, so soon, the shock and the grief will surely claim him for good this time. His death, a true and final death, will be on your hands, and your hands alone. The words were a poisoned dart, expertly crafted and aimed with lethal precision. They struck true, lodging deep in Beauty's most vulnerable, most tender fears. She looked toward the small cottage where she could see her father's silhouette moving past the window, and her resolve, which had felt so strong and righteous only moments before, began to waver, to fray at the edges. He did seem stronger, but was his recovery robust enough to withstand the fresh, gaping wound of her departure? Or was it a fragile, delicate porcelain thing that would shatter at the slightest touch? Her sisters saw the flicker of doubt, the shadow of uncertainty in her eyes, and they pressed their advantage with the ruthless skill of seasoned emotional predators. For the next 2 days, the 6th and the 7th, they were relentless. They surrounded her with a suffocating, cloying cloud of false love and manipulative concern. They wept real tears now, tears they were able to conjure through sheer force of will, tears of selfish frustration that they masterfully disguised as tears of loving desperation. They pleaded, they begged, they cajoled, they spoke constantly in hushed, worried tones of their father's fragile health, of their own desperate, aching need for their beloved sister's presence. They engineered conversations, prompting their father to speak of how his life had only just begun again, now that his little songbird, his only true joy, was home. They wove an invisible, inescapable net of love, guilt, and familial obligation, and with every passing hour, Beauty felt it tightening around her, constricting her breath, clouding her judgment, and silencing the small, insistent voice of her conscience. Her mind became a raging, chaotic battlefield. On one side stood the vivid, tangible, and beloved reality of her father, his face alight with newfound, fragile happiness. On the other side stood the increasingly hazy, dreamlike, and monstrous memory of a lonely creature in a distant, enchanted castle. She loved her father with every fibre of her being. The beast. What precisely did she feel for the beast? Pity, yes, a deep and abiding pity, a strange, undeniable, and growing affection, certainly. But was it love? Was it a bond strong enough, real enough to justify potentially sacrificing her own father's life on the altar of a promise? On the evening of the 7th day, the final night before she was sworn to return, she sat by the fire, her soul torn in two, ripped asunder by two conflicting, irreconcilable duties. Her sisters sat with her, one on each side, their physical presence a constant, pressing reminder of their arguments. Their faces were perfect models of loving, sisterly sorrow. Her father, tired from a happy day spent pottering in his workshop and humming cheerful off-key tunes, had gone to bed early. He was blissfully, heartbreakingly unaware of the silent, agonizing war that raged within his youngest daughter's heart. "Just one more day, Beauty," the eldest sister whispered, her voice a hypnotic serpentine hiss in the quiet, firelit room. "Stay just one more day, for father, to see his face so happy for one more sunrise. What harm could one single day possibly do? What is a mere 24 hours to a magical creature who has already lived for a century of lonely years?" One more day. The thought was a powerful, insidious, and deeply seductive siren song. It felt so reasonable, so compassionate, so right. What harm could a single, solitary day do? The beast was a creature of immense power, of potent and ancient magic. Surely he would not simply perish at the stroke of midnight like some fragile mortal in a fairy tale. He had been exaggerating, using hyperbole to frighten her, to ensure her swift return. The logic was deeply, fundamentally flawed, a self-serving lie, and she knew it in the deepest core of her being. But her heart, so desperate to believe it, so desperate for an easy answer that would absolve her of this impossible choice, clung to the idea with ferocious strength. She would stay one more day. She would cement her father's recovery, make him unbreakably happy, and then she would go. "All right," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire, the sound of her own capitulation, the sound of her vow breaking. One more day. Her sisters embraced her, their cries of joy and relief ringing jarringly, triumphantly false even to Beauty's confused and exhausted ears. But she ignored the tiny, screaming alarm bells in the deepest, most honest corners of her soul. She had made her decision. She would break her sacred oath. That night, however, her sleep was not the peaceful, restorative slumber she had known since her return. It was a tormented, feverish and deeply unsettling affair. She dreamt she was walking through the magnificent gardens of the castle, but the gardens were a nightmare version of what she remembered, a grotesque mockery of their former beauty. The riot of impossible year-round blooms was gone. The flowers were all withered, their petals black and brittle, crumbling to a greasy dust at her spectral touch. The leaves on the great, ancient trees were brown and desiccated, clinging to the branches like the hands of skeletons. The air was frigid and smelled of dust, decay, and a profound, final neglect. A terrible, soul-deep feeling of dread, cold and heavy as a shroud, washed over her. She began to run toward the castle, her dream feet stumbling on the cracked and dying earth. She found herself in the great hall, but the hundreds of candles were all extinguished, their wax melted into grotesque, weeping forms. The air was thick with cobwebs that clung to her face, and shadows that seemed to writhe and recoil from her presence. It was a tomb. She called out the beast's name, her voice a desperate, echoing cry in the vast, dead emptiness. There was no answer. The dream shifted with the jarring, illogical and terrifying leap of all nightmares. She was suddenly standing beside the bed of roses near the main gate, the very spot where her father's fateful error had begun this whole, terrible tale. And there, lying on the frozen, unforgiving ground, half hidden amongst the withered, thorny and skeletal bushes, was the beast. He was stretched out on the cold earth, utterly, profoundly and eternally motionless. His great, furred chest, which she had so often seen rising and falling in his sleep-like stupors, was still. His eyes, those sad, intelligent eyes that had held a universe of sorrow, were closed. The rain began to fall in her dream, a cold, miserable grey drizzle, matting his dark fur and washing the accumulated dust from his still, monstrous face. He looked not fearsome, not powerful, not magical. He looked pathetic. A great, lonely, abandoned creature, left to die in the dirt like a common animal. She awoke with a violent, shuddering gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to break free of her chest. Her face was wet, not with dream moisture, but with real, hot and terrified tears. The dream had been too vivid, too detailed, too horribly, viscerally real. It was not a dream, she knew with a sudden, chilling and absolute certainty that bypassed all logic and went straight to her soul. It was a vision. It was the castle's dying magic, or her own intrinsic mystical bond with it, screaming a final, desperate warning to her across the miles. She had broken her promise. She had been weak and foolish and selfish. One more day. A single insignificant day was all it took to extinguish a heart that had waited an entire century for a single drop of hope. The dawn of the 8th day was just beginning to break, painting the eastern sky in pale, accusing shades of grey, bruised purple and blood red. She had no time to waste. She scrambled out of bed, her limbs clumsy with haste, her hands trembling so violently she could barely function. She did not bother to dress, did not bother to wake her family, or attempt to explain the unexplainable. Clad only in her thin cotton nightgown, she fumbled on her bedside table for the plain gold ring. Her fingers closed around its cool, heavy and solid form. She slipped it onto her finger. She did not need to say the words. Her desire, her desperate, all-consuming and frantic need was a silent, powerful shout in the core of her soul. "Take me back. Take me back now. The world dissolved around her in that now familiar, nauseating rush. The cozy, cluttered bedroom vanished into nothingness. There was the brief, disorienting sensation of her very being turned inside out and restitched in an instant, and then she was standing on the cold, hard flagstones of the castle's main courtyard. The dream had not been a lie. The dream had been a mercy. The reality was infinitely worse. The air was frigid, holding the deep, biting, soul-dead chill of a true and final winter. The sky overhead was a uniform, leaden and utterly hopeless grey. The magnificent gardens, which she could see through the main archway, were a desolate, silent wasteland of black, skeletal branches and withered dead stalks swaying gently in a wind that made no sound. The castle itself felt inert. The profound silence was still there, but it was no longer the charged, magical silence of waiting. It was the empty, hollow, and eternal silence of the grave. The magic was gone. "Beast!" she cried out, her voice a desperate, panicked shriek that did not echo, but was simply swallowed, absorbed by the dead, oppressive air. "Beast, I am here. I have returned. I kept my promise. I am only a little late." There was no answer, only the cold, mournful, and utterly indifferent sigh of the wind as it whispered through the dead leaves at her feet. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, gave her legs a speed she did not know she possessed. She ran, her bare feet slapping against the freezing stones, through the great hall. It was dark, a thick grey layer of dust coating every surface, its hundreds of candles unlit, their wax melted into grotesque, weeping forms. Its atmosphere was one of deep, final, and irreversible neglect. She ran out into the dead gardens, her eyes scanning wildly, her heart a solid block of ice in her chest. She ran toward the withered rose bushes, her mind replaying the final, terrible scene from her dream with perfect, horrifying clarity. And there he was. He was lying on the ground, just as she had dreamt, stretched out beside the dead rosebush, his great body still, his eyes closed. He looked smaller, somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. The fearsome monster was gone, and in its place was only a large, sad, broken thing, returned to the earth from which it came. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his coarse fur, afraid to touch him, afraid to confirm what her heart, her soul, and every fibre of her being already knew to be the absolute, terrible truth. "No," she whispered, the word a choked, strangled, and utterly pathetic sob. "No, please, no." With a trembling, hesitant hand, a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, she reached out and touched his chest. It was cold as the stone beneath him, as cold as the grave. There was no rise and fall of breath, no faint, reassuring thud of a heartbeat beneath her palm. He was gone, and she had killed him. The realization hit her not like a blow, but like a slow, crushing weight, squeezing the air from her lungs, making her gasp and choke. She had killed him. She had killed him with her carelessness, with her weakness, with her selfish, indulgent desire for just one more day. A great, ragged wail of pure, undiluted, animal grief tore itself from her throat, a sound of absolute and total self-loathing. She had killed the only creature in the world who had truly seen her, who had truly listened to her, who had loved her in his own strange, sad, and monstrous way. "I'm so sorry," she wept, collapsing over his still form, her tears falling hot and fast onto his cold face, mingling with the morning dew on his dark fur. "I'm so sorry. I came back for you. Please, please, don't leave me alone here. I love you." The words tumbled out unbidden from a place in her heart she hadn't known existed, a place she had kept locked away until this very terrible moment. And in speaking them, she finally understood. It was the truth, the absolute, undeniable, and heartbreaking truth. In her selfish desire to be with her family, in her fear and her confusion, she had not allowed herself to see what had been quietly, patiently, and steadfastly growing in her heart for months. It was not pity, it was not merely affection, it was love, a strange, quiet, and profound love for the gentle, sorrowful soul she had sensed trapped inside the monstrous form. And she had only allowed herself to recognize it, to name it, At the very moment it had become hopelessly, irrevocably, and eternally too late. She sobbed, her body shaking with the force of her grief, her cries echoing unanswered in the dead, silent garden. "I love you," she whispered again, her voice raw, pressing her cheek against his still, silent face. "Please, come back to me. I love you." As her final, heartfelt, and utterly hopeless words faded into the cold morning air, a change began. A soft, warm, and intensely golden light began to emanate from the beast's body. It started as a faint, pearlescent glow, a warmth against her weeping cheek, then intensified with every beat of her own terrified, hopeful heart. It grew warmer, brighter, pulsing with a gentle, rhythmic cadence, like a great, sleeping heart starting anew. The light swelled, becoming so bright, so dazzlingly pure and powerful that Beauty was forced to shield her eyes, a gasp of disbelief and wondrous shock catching in her throat. The entire castle, the dead stones, the withered plants, the very air itself seemed to thrum with this returning energy, vibrating with a powerful, resurrected magic. The dead roses at her side began to bud and bloom in an instant, their petals unfurling in a wave of impossible color and fragrance. When the light finally subsided, its brilliance fading as gently and as gracefully as it had grown, she lowered her hands, her eyes wide with tear-blurred, incredulous astonishment. Lying on the ground where the beast had been was no longer a monster. In his place lay a man. A handsome young man with dark, flowing hair and a face that was both noble and profoundly kind, dressed in the simple, elegant clothes of a prince. He stirred, a soft groan escaping his lips, and his eyes fluttered open. They were the same eyes, the very same intelligent, sorrowful, and beautiful eyes she had come to know so well, had come to love without even realizing it. He looked at her, his expression one of dazed, profound confusion, before a slow, wondrous, and utterly human smile spread across his face, a smile that lit up the entire world. "Beauty," he said, and his voice was no longer a gravelly, monstrous rumble, but the clear, warm, and melodious voice of a man. "You came back, I knew you would." Beauty knelt on the cold, unforgiving earth, her body trembling not from the frigid air, but from the aftershocks of the dazzling, impossible light. The world, which had been a symphony of muted, hopeless greys, was now slowly, miraculously being repainted in color. The sky above was no longer a leaden, oppressive sheet, but a soft, promising blue, streaked with the delicate pinks and golds of a true sunrise. The air, once stale and smelling of dust and decay, was now filled with the sweet, intoxicating fragrance of a million blooming roses. All around her, the dead, skeletal garden was undergoing a silent, breathtaking resurrection. Withered branches swelled with green life, bursting forth with tender leaves. Dormant flower beds erupted in a slow-motion riot of color. Tulips, lilies, daffodils, their petals unfurling to greet a sun that had not truly shone on this place for a century. But Beauty saw none of this. Her entire world, her entire universe, was focused on the man who lay before her. Where a moment ago there had been the cold, still form of the monster she had loved and lost, there was now a stranger. A handsome young man, with hair as dark as a raven's wing and a face so finely sculpted it seemed to belong to one of the marble statues in the castle's galleries. He was dressed in clothes of deep blue velvet and white silk, clothes that were somehow pristine, untouched by the dirt and decay of the ground on which he lay. Her mind struggled to reconcile the two images, to bridge the impossible chasm between the monstrous form she knew and the princely visage she now beheld. He stirred, a soft groan escaping his lips, and his eyes, which had been closed in a stillness she had mistaken for death, fluttered open, and in that instant, all of her confusion vanished. They were the same eyes, the very same intelligent, sorrowful, and beautiful eyes she had come to know so well across the vast, lonely expanse of the dining table. The soul that looked out at her from this handsome stranger's face was the soul of her beast. He looked at her, his expression one of dazed, profound confusion. He lifted a hand, a human hand, with long, elegant fingers instead of fearsome claws, and stared at it as if it belonged to someone else. He touched his own face, his brow furrowed in disbelief. Then his gaze returned to her tear-streaked, awestruck face, and a slow, wondrous, and utterly human smile spread across his lips. A smile of such pure, unadulterated joy that it seemed to illuminate the entire world, eclipsing even the rising sun. "Beauty," he said, and his voice was not the gravelly, monstrous rumble that had been etched into her memory, but the clear, warm, and melodious voice of a man. "You came back. I knew you would." "I was late," she whispered, the words catching in her throat, a fresh wave of guilt washing over her. "I broke my promise. I almost—" "You did not break it," he interrupted gently, his voice resonating with a warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones, chasing away the last of the chill. He slowly, carefully pushed himself into a sitting position. "You returned. That is all that matters. Your love, whispered at the very last moment, was what broke the curse." He reached out, and with a touch that was infinitely tender, brushed a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Your love was the cure for my monstrousness, and your return was the cure for my despair." He rose to his feet, a little unsteadily at first, as if reacquainting himself with limbs he had not truly commanded for 100 years. He was tall and graceful, and he moved with an innate nobility that was both startling and yet completely, utterly familiar. He was the prince she had always sensed hiding beneath the fur and the fury. He held out his hand to her. She placed her own trembling, dirt-stained hand into his, and he gently pulled her to her feet. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his kind eyes holding hers. "A story I was too ashamed, too monstrous, to tell you before." As they stood there, hand in hand, amidst the miraculously blooming roses, a new sound began to fill the air. It was a faint, distant sound at first, a murmur, a hum. It was the sound of the castle itself waking from its long, enchanted slumber. The dust that had coated every surface for a century began to dissipate, not blown away by a wind, but simply dissolving into nothingness, revealing the gleaming marble and polished wood beneath. The thick, grey cobwebs vanished like mist in the morning sun. From deep within the castle, one by one, the hundreds of candles flickered to life, their warm, golden light spilling from every window. The prince began to speak, his voice a calm, sad melody against the backdrop of the reawakening castle. "I was born a prince, the sole heir to this kingdom. But I was a foolish, arrogant, and cruel youth. I was spoiled, and I valued things only for their outward beauty. I judged all people by their appearance, and I was unkind to any whom I deemed plain or beneath my station." As he spoke of his arrogance, a flock of white doves, which had been stone gargoyles only moments before, took flight from the castle ramparts, their wings beating a joyful rhythm against the morning air. "One day," he continued, his gaze distant with the memory of a pain a century old, "an old woman came to the castle gates, seeking shelter from a storm. She was bent and cloaked, and her face was weathered and plain. I took one look at her, and, in my pride and cruelty, I turned her away. I mocked her appearance and told her my beautiful castle was no place for such a wretched creature." He paused, a shadow of his old shame passing over his handsome features. "But she was no old beggar woman. She was a powerful enchantress. She dropped her disguise and revealed her true form, which was one of terrible and righteous beauty. She told me that since I could not see the beauty within others, I would wear my own monstrous soul on the outside, for all the world to see. She transformed me into the creature you knew, and my entire court, all the loyal servants who had been too timid to correct my foolish pride, were transformed alongside me into household objects, their silent forms a constant, living reproach for their failure to guide me." As he spoke of his servants, a new sound joined the symphony of the awakening castle. It was the sound of voices, human voices, laughter, cries of joy and disbelief, echoing from within the castle walls. "The curse had only one escape," the prince said, his eyes returning to Beauty's face, filled with a profound and humbling gratitude. "I had to find someone who could look past my terrifying exterior and come to love the man, the monster within. And I had to earn their love in return. The enchantress left me with a single, perfect rose. When the last petal fell from it, the curse would become permanent and all hope would be lost. For 100 years I lived in despair, Beauty. The rose withered, petal by petal, and with each one, my hope faded. I grew more bitter, more monstrous, more convinced that no one could ever love such a creature as I. And then, your father came. And then, you. He led her from the now vibrant garden into the great hall. It was no longer a dusty tomb, but a place of breathtaking splendor, gleaming and alive. And it was filled with people. Dozens of men and women, dressed in the livery of a royal court, were embracing, weeping and laughing. A stout, cheerful-looking man with a grand moustache, who Beauty vaguely recognized as having the shape of the pompous mantelpiece clock, was clapping a tall, thin and nervously elegant man on the back. This man, she realized with a jolt, had the same mannerisms as the candelabra who had so often lit her way. A kind-faced, matronly woman, whose warm and bustling energy was unmistakably that of the teapot, was hugging a small boy, the teacup, who was looking around with wide, wondrous eyes. They all turned as the prince and Beauty entered. A hush fell over the room, followed by a collective gasp. Then, as one, they all bowed deeply. The stout man, the majordomo, stepped forward, his face shining with unshed tears of joy. "My prince," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have returned to us." He then turned his gaze to Beauty, and his expression was one of pure, unadulterated reverence. "And you, my lady, you are the one. You broke the spell. We owe you not just our prince, but our very lives, our very humanity. How can we ever thank you?" Beauty, overwhelmed, could only blush and shake her head. "It was not I," she said softly. "It was he. His heart was always good. I was just the only one fortunate enough to be allowed to see it." The prince smiled, and his hand tightened on hers. He looked at her, and then at his gathered, joyful court. "There is one more thing that must be done to make this day perfect," he said. He looked at the simple gold ring on Beauty's finger. "That ring has the power to transport more than just one. Think of your father, Beauty. Think of your family. Wish for them to be here, to share in this joy." Beauty closed her eyes, her heart swelling with a love so immense it felt as if it could power the sun. She thought of her dear father, of his kind face, of his gentle hands. She thought of her brave, boisterous brothers. And yes, she even thought of her sisters. She wished for them all to be here, to see this miracle, to be a part of this new beginning. There was a soft shimmer of golden light near the great entrance of the hall. When it faded, her father and her 3 brothers stood there, their expressions a comical mixture of terror, confusion, and utter bewilderment. They were still in their rough country clothes, looking wildly out of place in the palatial splendor of the hall. "Father!" Beauty cried, rushing to him. "Beauty, my child, what is this place? What magic is this?" he stammered, his eyes wide as they took in the prince, the courtiers, the impossible grandeur of it all. The prince stepped forward and bowed graciously to the bewildered old man. "Sir," he said, his voice filled with respect, "I am the man who was once your jailer, but it is I who am forever in your debt, for you gave me the greatest treasure in the world, your daughter. With your blessing, I would ask for her hand in marriage." Beauty's father, his mind reeling, could only nod, his face breaking into a smile of pure, uncomprehending joy. Her brothers, seeing their sister's happiness and seeing the handsome, noble prince who so clearly adored her, let out whoops of celebration. But then another shimmer of light appeared. This time, when it faded, her 2 sisters stood there. They were dressed in their finest gowns, having clearly been in the middle of preening for their city suitors. Their expressions were not of joy or wonder, but of pure, slack-jawed shock. They stared at the prince, then at Beauty, who stood beside him, her hand in his, looking for all the world like a queen. They looked around at the magnificent living castle, at the happy, bowing courtiers. The truth, in all its undeniable, glittering and horrifying glory, dawned on them. Her prison was a paradise. Her monster was a handsome, wealthy prince. Her sacrifice was, in fact, the greatest triumph imaginable. The blood drained from their faces, replaced by the mottled, ugly colours of pure, concentrated envy. They could not speak. They could only stare, their hearts turning to leaden weights in their chests, their minds consumed by a single agonizing thought: it should have been me. As this toxic, hateful thought took root in their hearts, the enchantress's magic, which still lingered in the air of the castle, took notice. A pale, cold light enveloped the two sisters. They cried out in alarm as their fine gowns stiffened and their soft skin turned hard and grey. In a matter of seconds, they were transformed into two stone statues, their faces forever frozen in a mask of silent, impotent fury and gaping envy. Beauty gasped, rushing forward, but the prince gently held her back. "It is the final piece of the curse," he said softly, his voice tinged with a sad pity. "They have been given a prison of their own making. They will stand here, at the entrance to the castle, forced to witness the happiness they tried so hard to prevent. They will remain as stone until their hearts, their true hearts, can feel genuine remorse and joy for another's good fortune." And so, the wedding was held in the great sunlit hall of the reborn castle. Beauty's father gave her away, his face a portrait of perfect happiness. Her brothers celebrated with the prince's joyful court, and at the entrance to the castle, two stone statues stood as silent, eternal witnesses. The prince and Beauty ruled his kingdom with a kindness and wisdom that became a legend in its own right. He, having known the ugliness of a monstrous exterior, never again judged anyone by their appearance. And she, having seen the profound beauty of a loving heart trapped within a fearsome form, taught all her subjects that true sight comes not from the eyes, but from a heart willing to look past the surface and see the quiet, often hidden, magic within. They lived a long and happy life, their love a testament to the idea that the most terrifying curses can be broken and the most beautiful roses can bloom in the most unexpected of places. And their story, a tale of monsters and magic, of promises broken and kept, and of a love that saw beyond the veil of the visible, would be told for generations, often, as it is being told now, as a gentle whisper in the quiet of the night. The miracle in the garden was not a singular, explosive event, a sudden, sharp crack of divine intervention that reset the world to its proper, preordained order. It was something far more profound, far more organic, and infinitely more beautiful. It was the beginning of a slow and wondrous unfolding, like watching a time-lapse film of a century of springtimes occurring all at once. The breaking of the curse was not an end, but a complicated, messy, and achingly beautiful beginning. For 100 years, the castle and all its inhabitants had been a place of silent, suspended, and suffocating sorrow, a world trapped in the flawless, unbreakable amber of a single, vengeful moment. Now it was filled with the sounds of a world waking up, and the joyous, chaotic, and often deeply poignant process of its people rediscovering the lost art of their own humanity. In the days that followed the transformation, the castle was a place of beautiful, gentle, and pervasive confusion. The curse had not just stolen their forms, it had stolen their habits, their muscle memories, their very sense of physical self. The servants, who had spent a century as clocks, candelabras, teapots, and wardrobes, now had to relearn the simple, forgotten, and often frustrating art of navigating the world in a body of flesh, bone, and fallibility. The majordomo, a man whose name was Lumiere and who had spent a lifetime as the grand, unerringly precise mantelpiece clock, found himself in a state of constant, low-grade, existential anxiety. His internal, perfect, metronomic sense of time, the very core of his identity, was gone, replaced by the fallible, fluid, and deeply unreliable human perception of its passage. He would constantly be checking the position of the sun, muttering to himself about the imprecision of it all, his brow furrowed in genuine distress. He would announce the time for dinner with a booming, authoritative voice, only to be a half-hour off, much to the good-natured, gentle amusement of the kitchen staff. He was a man without his inner gears, and he felt adrift in the great, unticking ocean of the day. The maitre d', a tall, thin, and perpetually anxious man named Cogsworth, who had endured his long sentence as a gilded, ornate candelabra, was plagued by a different set of spectral habits. He would walk into dimly lit rooms and instinctively try to brighten his own presence, his hands rising in a familiar gesture, his mind half expecting his fingers to burst into bright, steady flame. He would catch himself in the act, his face flushing a deep, mortified crimson, and he would stammer a string of apologies to no one in particular. He found he had an aversion to drafts, and would spend his days trying to close doors and windows, a 100-year-old instinct to protect his delicate flames still warring with his new human reality. The head housekeeper, a warm and matronly woman named Mrs. Potts, whose spirit was as round, comforting, and unbreakable as the ceramic form she had inhabited, found herself rediscovering the world alongside her young son, Chip, who had been a teacup. He had no memory of being anything else, and the world was a source of constant, wide-eyed wonder and 1,000 questions. Mrs. Potts would find herself patting her side when she spoke, half expecting to find a spout and handle, her center of gravity still calibrated for a body that was mostly belly and spout. She would try to pour tea from a real teapot and misjudge the distance, her movements still possessing the memory of a controlled, graceful tilt that her human arms could not quite replicate. They would all laugh at these shared, ghostly habits, their communal laughter echoing through halls that had known only the beast's lonely sighs and beauty's solitary footsteps for a lifetime. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of healing. It was a time of relearning the simple, forgotten miracles, the surprising weight of their own limbs, the feel of a cool breeze on a cheek, the complex and wonderful symphony of taste, the simple, profound pleasure of a shared meal, eaten with hands and cutlery instead of being magically and impersonally served from an empty table. Prince Adrian, as the world now remembered him, was undergoing his own quiet and profound re-education, one that was perhaps the most solitary and difficult of all. He had spent a century as a creature of immense strength, primal instinct, and absolute soul-crushing solitude. Now he had to reacquaint himself with the delicate, intricate, and often terrifying nuances of human interaction and human frailty. He would sometimes forget the fragility of the world around him, gripping a crystal goblet so tightly that it would groan in his hand, threatening to shatter into 1,000 pieces. He would forget the modulation of his own voice, beginning a sentence in a low, resonant rumble, a sound that still held the faint echo of the beast, that would startle a songbird from a nearby tree. This habit, more than any other, brought a look of deep, reflexive shame to his face. He had to learn how to navigate a world of people again, of courtiers, ministers, and petitioners who were suddenly reappearing from their own timeless slumber in the surrounding towns and villages, drawn back to the castle by a magical pull they could not explain. They would look at him with awe and deference, their minds having to bridge a gap of 100 forgotten years, seeing him as the perfect, restored prince. But inside, Adrian still felt the shadow of the monster. He would have nightmares, dreams where his hands grew claws again, where his voice deepened into a roar, where he would see Beauty's face filled with the old, familiar fear. He would wake from these dreams in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, and it would take him long moments to remember his own human form, to feel the soft sheets of his bed instead of a cold stone floor. Most of all, he had to learn how to simply be with Beauty, not as a monstrous, desperate jailer pleading for his life, but as a man in love. He had to unlearn the dynamic of their strange, sad courtship. He found himself watching her for hours, a look of utter, humbled awe on his face. He would watch her as she read in the library, the afternoon sun creating a halo in her dark hair, and he would be overcome with a feeling of such profound unworthiness that he would have to turn away. He still could not quite believe she was real, that she had chosen to stay, that she had seen past the monster and loved the man within, a man he himself had long thought dead. His love for her was so immense, so powerful, it was almost painful, a sun too bright to look at directly after a century of utter darkness. Beauty, for her part, navigated this strange, miraculous and disorienting new world with the same quiet grace and steady, compassionate heart that had sustained her through the darkest days of her captivity. She was no longer a prisoner, but she did not yet feel like a princess. The title felt like an ill-fitting gown, a role she had not auditioned for. She was something in between, a bridge between two worlds, the humble, loving cottage and the magnificent reborn castle. Her father and brothers were her anchors to the world she had known, a constant, loving reminder of who she was and where she came from. They lived in the castle now, in opulent suites of their own that left them perpetually, comically bewildered, but they carried their simple country ways with them like precious, grounding cargo. Her father, his health and spirit so completely restored that he seemed to have grown younger and more spry, would spend his days not in the throne room or the council chambers, but in the castle's vast, sunlit kitchens. He would sit for hours at the great, flower-dusted wooden work table, happily chatting with the cooks and bakers, who were overjoyed to have a new, appreciative audience. He shared his extensive knowledge of humble, wild herbs, teaching the royal chefs remedies and recipes that had been passed down through generations of his own simple family. He found his purpose not in being the father of a princess, but in being a valued member of the castle's bustling, happy, domestic heart. Her brothers, looking profoundly awkward and perpetually uncomfortable in the fine silks and velvets the court tailors provided, would often eschew the manicured lawns and formal gardens to go hunting in the dense, wild forests that bordered the kingdom. They would return at dusk, their faces flushed, their boots muddy, carrying game for the kitchens, their boisterous laughter and unpretentious manners a welcome, rustic and earthy sound in the otherwise refined and formal atmosphere of the court. Their presence was a constant reminder to everyone, from the prince down to the lowest scullery maid, that true nobility was a matter of character, At the castle's not great of birth. stone entrance, the two statues of her sisters stood in their eternal, silent and impotent vigil. They quickly became a strange and potent landmark, a required stop for all visitors to the castle, a solemn postscript to the tale of the curse. Courtiers and servants would pass them on their way in and out of the castle, their expressions a complex mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and sober reflection. The statues were a living, or rather unliving, testament to the curse's final cutting lesson, that a heart turned to stone by envy is its own, self-inflicted and eternal prison. Beauty would sometimes visit them, often in the quiet of the early morning, before the castle was fully awake. She would stand before them, a sad, gentle expression on her face, and trace the lines of their frozen, furious features with her eyes. She did not hate them. The capacity for that kind of acidic, corrosive resentment was not within her. She only pitied them with a deep and sorrowful pity. She hoped, with a quiet, persistent hope, that one day, in the silent, lonely eternity of their stony existence, they would find the single, elusive spark of genuine remorse, the one selfless wish for another's happiness that might finally set them free. She would sometimes leave a single, perfect rose at their stone feet, a silent offering of a forgiveness they could not yet accept. The preparations for the royal wedding began. It was decided by both Beauty and Adrian that it would not be a rushed, ostentatious affair, but a slow, deliberate, and joyful process, a grand symbol of the kingdom's own patient and miraculous rebirth. Weavers from across the land, whose families had passed down the dormant, legendary royal commission for generations, were summoned to the castle. They set up their great, ancient and beautiful wooden looms in a long, sun-drenched gallery, and their shuttles began to click and clack, a rhythmic, industrial and deeply hopeful heartbeat in the castle's core. They were creating a fabric for Beauty's gown that was said to be woven from moonlight, silver threads spun from moonbeams, and the dew collected from the petals of the very first roses to bloom after the curse was broken. Musicians, old men who had been aspiring young boys when the curse fell, and young men who were now learning from resurrected songbooks, their ink still miraculously fresh, now filled the halls with gentle, hopeful, and sometimes hesitant compositions. They practiced for the ceremony, their melodies the sound of a culture rediscovering its own voice. The castle's bakers and chefs, led by a gleeful and tireless Mrs. Potts, worked day and night. They were not using the old, instantaneous and soulless magic of the curse, but their own rediscovered human skill, their own hands, their own senses of taste and smell. They planned a feast that would celebrate not just the return of their beloved prince, but the return of their own craft, their own purpose, their own humanity. During this vibrant, busy and hopeful time, The true, quiet, and intimate courtship of Beauty and the Prince finally began. They would steal away for hours from the happy chaos, walking hand in hand through the endlessly blooming gardens. He would tell her stories of his lonely, monstrous existence, stories he had been too deeply ashamed to share before. He spoke of the long, slow, maddening passage of the years, of the despair that had become so total and so normal that he had forgotten what hope even felt like. He spoke of watching her from the shadows of the castle, of the light and life she brought into his dark, silent world, a light he felt he was profoundly, fundamentally unworthy to even stand in. She, in turn, spoke of her life in the cottage, of her simple, uncomplicated love for books and flowers, and of the strange, creeping, and deeply confusing affection she had begun to feel for him, an affection she had been too afraid and too bewildered to name, even to herself. They were not a prince and a commoner, not a hero and a damsel in the final chapter of a fairy tale. They were simply two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely and desolate of circumstances. Their love forged not in the glittering artifice of a ballroom or the passion of a stolen kiss, but in the quiet, shared solitude of a cursed and lonely castle, a love built on conversation, companionship, and a profound shared understanding of loneliness. The day of the wedding arrived. It was a perfect, crystalline autumn day, the kind of day that feels both like a vibrant celebration of life and a gentle, poignant farewell to the year. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless, and impossibly deep blue, and the air was crisp and cool, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves from the distant forests. The entire kingdom seemed to hold its collective breath in a state of joyful, reverent anticipation. Beauty's gown was a masterpiece of elegant simplicity, its beauty residing not in ornamentation, but in the perfection of its cut and the subtle, otherworldly shimmer of its fabric, which seemed to capture and hold the light. It was unadorned with jewels or gold embroidery, for she had insisted that her only gems were the happy, shining eyes of the people she loved. Her only ornament was a single, perfect, snow-white rose, a gift from Adrian that morning, tucked carefully by Mrs. Potts into her dark, flowing hair. It was a symbol not of a debt to be paid or a bargain struck, but of a love freely, simply, and completely given. The ceremony was held not in the imposing, cavernous throne room with its heavy connotations of power, duty, and lineage, but in the great circular library, the place where their true connection, their meeting of minds and spirits, had first taken root among the silent, waiting stories. The room was filled to capacity with the entire resurrected court, with tradespeople and farmers from the local villages who stood shoulder to shoulder with dukes and duchesses, and with her own beaming, weeping family. The afternoon light streamed through the high, arched windows, illuminating the countless books that stood as silent, leather-bound witnesses to the happy ending of a story they had themselves contained for a century. There was no grand pronouncement, no ostentatious display of royal power. They stood before an elderly, kind-faced cleric whose own life had been paused for 100 years, and they spoke their vows in quiet, clear voices that needed no amplification in the reverent silence of the room. Their words were a simple, heartfelt promise not of dominion or dynasty, but of faith, friendship, and lifelong, steadfast companionship. When Prince Adrian slipped a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger, placing it right next to the magical ring she had chosen to keep as a humble reminder of their incredible journey, it felt not like a royal ceremony, but like two people, two dear and lonely friends, finally, irrevocably, coming home to each other. The gentle, hopeful music swelled, and a sigh of pure, collective, and cathartic happiness seemed to pass through the gathered crowd. Later that evening, long after the last of the celebratory feast had been cleared away and the final joyful notes of music had faded into the tranquil night, Beauty and Prince Adrian stood together on a high, secluded balcony overlooking their sleeping kingdom. The castle was a warm, living beacon of light behind them, a testament to their love. Before them, the lights of the town and the surrounding villages twinkled in the soft autumn darkness, a perfect, humble mirror of the vast starry sky above. The world was finally, blessedly at peace. "Are you happy?" he asked her, his voice a soft murmur in the quiet of the night, a question still tinged with a faint residual disbelief, as if he still feared that this perfect, quiet moment might yet be a dream from which he would wake, alone and monstrous. Beauty leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the cool, clean, and free air. She thought of her incredible, impossible journey, from the simple, loving cottage to the terrifying, magnificent, and lonely castle, and now here to this moment of profound, quiet, and perfect peace. She thought of the monster she had feared, then pitied, then, finally and irrevocably, loved. She thought of her family, safe, happy, and whole, sleeping under the same enchanted roof. She thought of the long, peaceful, and beautifully ordinary road that lay before them. "Yes," she whispered, her heart so full and so calm it felt as if it were a star itself, not burning with a fiery passion, but radiating a quiet, steady, and eternal light. "More than I ever knew it was possible to be." They stood there for a long, long time, wrapped in a comfortable, contented silence that was the polar opposite of the crushing silence they had once known, watching the stars wheel overhead. The great adventure, with its dramatic curses and its terrifying monsters, was over. The wedding, with its pomp and its celebration, was done. Now, all that was left was the long, quiet, and beautiful task of living out their happily ever after. Not as a fairy tale ending that is a destination, but as a daily, deliberate, and deeply cherished choice, day by gentle, peaceful, and loving day. The concept of happily ever after is, in most tales, a closed door, a final, gilded period at the end of a sentence. But in the reborn kingdom, it was an open field at sunrise, vast and quiet and filled with the gentle, unfolding work of a new day. Life after the miracle was not a succession of grand balls and triumphant parades. It was quieter, more profound. It was a life built of small, deliberate moments, of new routines being forged, and of a deep, collective exhale that had been held for 100 years. The first season of their marriage was autumn. The days grew shorter, the air crisper, and the great forests that surrounded the castle became a breathtaking tapestry of crimson, gold, and amber. It was a season of settling, a time for the kingdom and its rulers to find their new, natural rhythm. Their days began in quietude. They would wake in their chambers, where the morning light, soft and golden, would slant through the tall eastern windows. For Adrian, these first waking moments were a private, daily miracle. For a century, his consciousness had returned each day to a world of fur and claws, to a body that was a prison. Now, to wake in a human form, to feel the warmth of beauty sleeping beside him, was a gift so profound it often brought a silent, grateful tear to his eye. He would lie there for long moments, simply breathing, reacquainting himself with the simple, forgotten sensation of being a man. They would break their fast not in the cavernous great hall, but in a small, sun-drenched solarium that overlooked the eastern gardens. The frantic, magical service of the curse was gone, replaced by the gentle, human bustle of the castle staff. Mrs. Potts would bring them their tea, her smile a constant, warm presence, and they would eat fresh bread, baked that morning in the castle's roaring ovens. It sent a comforting, domestic perfume that now permanently filled the castle's lower corridors. Their conversations were soft, murmured things, plans for the day, observations about the changing light, a shared passage from a book one of them had been reading the night before. It was a simple, easy companionship that felt more precious to them than all the crown jewels in the treasury. After their quiet breakfast, their days would diverge, each finding their purpose in their own domain. Prince Adrian would make his way to the council chambers. This was not the grand, intimidating throne room, but a smaller, more intimate circular chamber, lined with old maps and warmed by a perpetual fire. Here, he began the slow, painstaking work of learning to be a king. He was not the arrogant boy who had been cursed. The monster had been a harsh but effective teacher. His century of solitude had scoured away his pride, leaving in its place a deep and abiding empathy. He would spend his mornings with his reawakened ministers, patiently listening. He learned of the state of the kingdom, of villages that had become isolated, of roads that had fallen into disrepair, of laws that had not been updated in over 100 years. He did not issue grand, sweeping decrees. His work was quiet, methodical, and compassionate. He would spend an entire afternoon discussing the proper placement of a new grain silo for a farming village, or the fairest way to re-establish trade routes with a neighboring territory. He reviewed the ancient legal scrolls, his fingers tracing the faded ink, and with Beauty's quiet counsel, he began to amend the laws, softening their harsh edges, ensuring they were rooted not in power, but in justice and compassion. He was not rebuilding a kingdom, he was healing it, one small, patient, and deliberate act at a time. While Adrian tended to the body of the kingdom, Beauty tended to its soul. She found her own purpose not in the endless fittings for royal gowns or the complex etiquette of the court, but in the two places that had been her sanctuary during her captivity, the library and the gardens. She took the castle's vast, magnificent gardens as her personal charge. The curse had kept them in a state of perpetual, unnatural bloom. Now, under the gentle hand of nature, they were beginning to follow the true rhythm of the seasons. She would spend her mornings there with the head gardener, a wizened, sun-beaten old man who had spent his 100 years of enchantment as a sturdy, reliable watering can. Together, they began the monumental task of cataloguing the garden's impossible collection of flora. Beauty, with her love of books, would sit on a stone bench, a great leather-bound ledger open on her lap, and carefully sketch each flower, each leaf, noting its habits, its colors, its fragrance. It was a slow, meditative work that brought her a deep sense of peace. She learned the names of 100 different varieties of rose, the subtle differences between strains of lavender, the ancient medicinal properties of herbs that grew in the shaded corners of the garden walls. She was not a princess admiring her domain. She was a naturalist, a scholar, a caretaker, her hands often stained with the rich, dark earth. In the afternoons, she would retreat to the library. It was here that she and Adrian would often find their way back to each other. The library, for all its splendor, had been neglected for a century. The books were out of order, coated in a fine layer of dust that the initial magic had not completely erased. Together, they began the quiet, colossal project of reorganizing it. They would work in a comfortable silence, Adrian on a tall, rolling ladder, carefully taking down heavy volumes, while Beauty sat at a long table, cataloguing them, her quill scratching softly in the quiet air. It was in these shared, silent hours that their love deepened, settling from a miraculous, dramatic event into a steady, reliable, and profoundly comforting presence. Sometimes Adrian would find a passage in a book of history that pertained to one of his council meetings, and he would read it aloud to her, his clear, melodious voice filling the quiet space. Sometimes Beauty would discover a book of poetry whose verses so perfectly captured the beauty of the autumn light outside that she would share it with him. They were building not just a library, but a shared life, a life of the mind and the heart, story by story, page by page. Their evenings were the quiet culmination of their days. They would dine together, often with her father and brothers, their table filled with simple food and easy laughter. The oppressive silence of the past was replaced by a warm, gentle hum of conversation. After dinner, they would retire to the library, which had truly become the heart of the castle. A fire would be roaring in the great fireplace, casting a warm, dancing glow on the thousands of sleeping books. They would not always talk. Often they would simply sit in two large, comfortable armchairs, each reading their own book, the only sound the soft rustle of a turning page and the crackle and pop of the burning logs. In these moments, they were not a prince and princess. They were not the subjects of a fairy tale. They were simply two people who had found their perfect, quiet peace in each other's company. As autumn deepened, the days grew shorter still. The last of the golden leaves fell from the trees, carpeting the castle grounds in a thick, rustling blanket. The air grew colder, carrying the sharp, clean scent of approaching winter. And then one morning, they awoke to a world transformed anew. A soft, thick, and perfect blanket of snow had fallen during the night, covering the entire kingdom in a pristine, unbroken sheet of white. The silence of the castle changed again. It was no longer the silence of sorrow, nor the bustling silence of busy work. It was the deep, muffled, and profoundly peaceful silence of a winter's day. The snow absorbed all sound, creating a sense of being enclosed, safe, and sheltered from the outside world. That day, all work in the kingdom seemed to pause. Adrian did not go to the council chamber. Beauty did not go to the gardens. Instead, they walked together through the snow-covered grounds, their boots making the only crunching sounds in the quiet world. They watched as the castle servants, now fully re-embracing their humanity, engaged in a joyous, spontaneous snowball fight in the great courtyard, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. They saw Mrs. Potts helping a bundled-up Chip build his first-ever snowman. They walked to the edge of the great, frozen lake, its surface a perfect grey mirror reflecting the winter sky. Adrian, who had paced the shores of this lake for 100 winters as a lonely, tormented creature, now stood there as a man, his hand held firmly in Beauty's, his heart filled not with despair, but with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. He looked at the castle, its stone walls now softened by their mantle of snow, smoke curling gently from its many chimneys, a perfect picture of warmth and safety. The curse had given him 100 winters of solitude and cold. But this, he knew, was the first true winter of his life. It was a season not of death and dormancy, but of rest, of quiet reflection, and of waiting patiently for the inevitable return of the spring. That night, as the fire roared in the library hearth and the snow continued to fall softly outside the tall, dark windows, Adrian and Beauty sat in their chairs, a thick woolen blanket shared across their laps. The books remained on their shelves. The business of the kingdom could wait. They simply sat together, watching the flames, feeling the immense, quiet peace of the castle around them. The story of their courtship was over. The story of their life, a long and quiet and beautiful story, was just beginning to be written. And they knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as quiet as the falling snow, that they would have all the time in the world to write it together.